President Biden is set to unveil his 2024 budget proposal tomorrow. Topping the list, tax increases on high-income Americans, cutting the deficit and extending the life of Medicare, again by raising taxes. Joining us right now for more on this is House Democratic leader, New York Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. And Mr. Leader, it's very good to have you here. We appreciate it. How are you doing today?
Good morning. Great to be with you.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the budget, because this is the lead story in the New York Times and a lot of other newspapers this morning. People are looking at this, wondering what to expect, and already we're getting some pretty big details. We've been talking this morning about Medicare in particular, shoring that system up, but doing it by raising taxes. I wonder if you'll weigh in on that, first of all.
Well, it's my expectation that President Biden's budget is going to invest in the future sustainability of Medicare and Social Security, invest in education and job training, invest in research and development, invest in transportation and infrastructure, invest in technology and innovation, invest in the creation and preservation of affordable housing, and overall just invest in the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people as part of his wonderful effort to build an economy from the middle out and the ground up.
One of our reporters dug into what some of those increases will mean and what it will mean for New Yorkers in your district, and was just pointing out that with these proposed tax increases, if they were to go through, including that Medicare taxes going to 5% from 3.8% and the cap being lifted, it will mean that New Yorkers who are making $400,000 or more could be facing a tax rate of 59.6% when you add up the state and local taxes. Do you worry about that, just your own constituents?
Here's what I worry about. The overwhelming majority of the people that I represent in the 8th Congressional District, just like the overwhelming majority of the American people, will not experience a very, very modest tax increase in order to extend out the future of Medicare. Right now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the Medicare Trust Fund is slated to be insolvent by the year 2033. And so President Biden is taking a very responsible step to try to extend it out to 2050 in order to make sure that tens of millions of Americans can retire with grace and dignity, folks who have paid into Medicare throughout their entire lives and have an expectation that it will be there for them in their golden years.
No question that Medicare is a very important program and that it needs to be shored up. I guess the bigger issue is what happens, because this is already being declared dead on arrival. It's not going to pass in the House. So what do you do? What kind of compromises do you look for? How do you think there is something? Do you find any common ground? What are you thinking so far?
Well, we always want to find common ground whenever and wherever possible. But in order for that to happen, the Republicans actually need to show us their plan. Unfortunately, what we have right now is a situation where President Biden has been very clear. He's going to release his budget tomorrow. It will be in the public domain. The American people will have an opportunity to fully review it. The Congress can debate it. But right now, we haven't seen a plan from House Republicans. In the past, their plan has been to dramatically cut taxes for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, often unpaid for. Unfortunately, that was the reality in 2017, and it has not delivered the benefits for the overwhelming majority of Americans that had been promised. We've seen budget plans in the past that have sought to repeal the Affordable Care Act, that have sought to undermine Social Security and Medicare. And what we're saying is for us to have a reasonable debate, a transparent debate, then House Republicans need to show the American people their plan.
It's great to have you on, Leader Jeffries. I begged the speaker to talk to you, and he was funny. He goes, when Hakeem is on, just tell him, remind him that he had 100% of his caucus voted for him too. So just don't rest on all your when he was minority leader. He goes tell him that, and then look what happened a couple years later. Anyway. We just had Judd Gregg, former senator, former governor of New Hampshire. He worries about this is essentially drug pricing, and that will hurt innovation. Coming out of the pandemic, where we saw how the innovation of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry really did, maybe it's overstating it to say they saved us collectively, but certainly we've developed that vaccine very effectively and very quickly. Do you think that are you for drug pricing? Don't you think that that hurts innovation and that these companies need capital to deal with Alzheimer's and all these diseases that are going to get worse and worse as the population ages?
I think Big Pharma has done incredibly well in terms of profitability. And there were partnerships that were facilitated by the U.S. government during moments of crisis, including the pandemic. But there were investments that were made in research and development over decades, paid for by the taxpayers, that have put us into a position where some advancements can be made by entities within the pharmaceutical industry. Now, here's what I'm for. Here's what Democrats are for. We are for the American people paying $35 per month for things like insulin, as opposed to approximately $4,000 per year for a drug that has been in existence since about 1922, where there's no additional research or investment or innovation that needs to be made, and no reason that the American people were paying thousands and thousands of dollars. So we have to strike the right balance and build upon what has been put into law, including giving Medicare the ability to negotiate lower drug prices on behalf of the American people. That is a basic principle in capitalism, which means you get to use your bulk price purchasing power to negotiate lower prices. Walmart does it. Target does it, Best Buy does it. The American people should have the ability to do it as well.
The other thing that Senator Gray was pointing out was for decades, the Social Security, Medicare have been the third rail, and you say Republicans don't have a plan, and whenever they talk about, even broach the idea of trying to make both of these programs, Social Security, Medicare, more solvent, you immediately, or many Democrats, President Biden, go to the, you want to cut people's Social Security. Republicans want to cut people's Medicare. There needs probably to be a more, not only bipartisan, but a more fundamental change in some of the provisions that we have to really make it solvent, to really make it work. And we never get that. We never get a bipartisan effort. You say you want to be bipartisan, and actually, Speaker McCarthy was saying that he's worked with you on China, worked with you on other things. He was kind of checking off all the bipartisan things. Why not both sides approach this as adults and try to work something out that really preserves these programs instead of what sometimes looks like demagoguery?
Well, Speaker McCarthy and I have worked well together for the good of the institution. And I look forward to continuing to have forward-looking conversations to try to do what is in the best interest of the American people in partnership whenever and wherever possible. There will be times, as Speaker McCarthy has indicated, that we will strongly disagree, perhaps around the future of Social Security and Medicare. My overall point is that for us to have a reasonable conversation to try to find common ground, then the Republicans need to show us their plan. President Biden is going to do that tomorrow. It will be in the public domain. But we believe in a well-regulated, market-based economy that has been a tremendous engine of growth and prosperity, helped to build the greatest American middle class, greatest middle class, I should say, in the history of the world. And now we have to make sure that we preserve that. Part of it is a strong social safety net anchored in things like Social Security and Medicare. And so that is going to be a big part of President Biden's budget. We can have a discussion about how to make that sustainable, but we need to see a Republican plan. And many people are reasonably concerned that the reason why we don't see a plan is because it's too extreme for the American people to absorb.
Congressman Jeffries, as you mentioned, we'll get this budget tomorrow. We're going to hear a lot more about this. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about the economy, though, because that's what we focus on and what we've been hearing. Yesterday, we did hear from the Fed head, Jay Powell, speaking before the Senate, where he was talking about how the Fed's very likely going to have to raise rates higher and faster than people had been anticipating. You know the pain that does put on people everywhere. Inflation's a horrible problem, needs to be figured out. But if we are talking about raising rates, increasing borrowing costs for Americans, for businesses, trying to do that while inflation's higher, and the concern that that could cause an economic downturn, what do you think, just in terms of what you're watching with the Fed, what your concerns are about the economy?
Well, let's think about where we've been and where we are now. When the American Rescue Plan was passed under the leadership of President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, Democrats in the House and the Senate, we were able to rescue the economy and save it from a deep recession, set us on a path, shots in arms, money in pockets, kids back in school, to emerge with an economy that's stronger post-pandemic than any other economy in the Western world. Yes, there are challenges that need to be met around inflation. However, when you take a step back and look at the economy, more than 12 million good-paying jobs created during President Biden's first 2 years in office. That's a record. Unemployment at around 3.5%, a record 50-year low. More small businesses have been created over the last 2 years than in any other time in American history. That's extraordinary. And on top of all that, the deficit has been reduced during President Biden's first 2 years by $1.7 trillion. More needs to be done. We recognize that. President Biden is going to lead with building an economy from the middle out and the ground up, as opposed to the top down, to make sure we continue to build upon the great American middle class. That's good for everyone. That's good for democracy. It's good for the wealthiest amongst us, and it's good for America.
Leader Jeffries, we had Patrick McHenry on earlier, and we said, we have Leader Jeffries coming on. What would you like? What would you say when we had a pretty good idea? You'd talk about the jobs that you say were created, the deficit being reduced, and the messaging from the Biden administration. Here's what he came up with, and you can respond in a second.
This is like an adult showing up at a Little League game and saying that they can crush them, right? When we're coming off the pandemic and federal closures of the economy, and you're saying, wow, we created new jobs. I mean, come on, give me a break. When you say we went from record deficits when the economy is shut down, I mean, give me a break. So some of these things are just cherry-picked, the same political tripe that we always get out of politics in Washington, and people are sick of this. The fact is, we have an inflation problem and an economic challenge.
That's we hear it from both sides all the time. Leader, what do you make of what he said? I mean, you do reopen the economy. Created, we finally got back to where jobs were, but I think it's a little strange to call it created when you reopen an economy and the jobs that were lost come back.
Yeah, the reality is, when you look at where the American economy is compared to any other developed economy in the world, the facts are clear. We have emerged in a stronger position. That's not fantasy. That's not fiction. That is fact. And the reality is, when you look at what Democratic presidential administrations have been able to do consistently over time on issues like fiscal responsibility and job creation, tens of millions of jobs were created collectively during the presidencies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and now, of course, President Joe Biden, while at the same time engaging in very fiscally responsible behavior. President Clinton inherited a deficit and turned that into a surplus. Barack Obama inherited unpaid for tax cuts, 2 failed wars, and an economy in deep recession, and wound up reducing the deficit by $1 trillion. And I've already cited the Biden economic record. This is the result of our policies that lean in and create the best possible economy for the greatest number of Americans.
Leader Jeffries, let me just ask you about some breaking news that just came out. ADP jobs report came out, and that number was stronger than expected for the month of February. It was a gain of 242,000. The street was only looking for 205,000. And this is one of those good news, maybe bad news scenarios. It's great to hear the strong economy. It's great to hear jobs are being created, but it does raise the prospect that the Fed is going to raise rates even higher in an attempt to try and break inflation and bring down the economy. Do you worry that the Fed is going to do too much, bring rates too high, and cause the economy to come in and fall into a recession?
It's a very reasonable concern because what we don't want is the Fed to trigger a recession. and then set us back. So there is a balance that needs to be struck here in trying to tame inflationary pressures that have impacted the economy. I know year over year, over the last 6 months, inflation is down, but there are still concerns that it is ticking upward in the wrong direction. Those are reasonable concerns to be addressed in terms of monetary policy, but we don't want to go too far in triggering a recession. We'll see what the Fed does, and I'll be in a position to be able to comment more intelligently thereafter.
The inflation that we do see, Leader, I think, and I don't want to relitigate, Trump and what you call the tax cuts or Republicans, but so $8 trillion added to the deficit during the Trump years, 4 of them. Another $8 trillion added in the first 2 years of President Biden's administration. That's $16 trillion, puts us at $32 trillion, and many people say that that's why inflation is so high, at 40-year highs, since the 80s, and it does hurt low-income people more than the rest. And there's a reason the Fed is willing, basically, to raise unemployment just to get inflation under control. Do you at least concede that some of the inflation is because we overspent, both the prior administration and the current administration, to get the $32 trillion in terms of debt?
Well, let's understand one thing in terms of the debt situation that we find ourselves in. And by the way, we're going to have to raise the debt ceiling, do it responsibly. It was done 3 times without fanfare under the prior administration, and it should be done in this particular instance to avoid a catastrophic default that will hurt the economy, undermine the U.S. dollar's presence as the world's reserve currency, and really hurt small businesses and everyday Americans. But yes, it's reasonable for us to have a conversation moving forward about how do we continue to reduce the deficit and bring our debt into a better situation. That's what President Biden has been able to do. That's what I believe he will continue to do. And we look forward to having that discussion with our Republican colleagues, but they have to present us their plan in order for us to have a legitimate debate.